All right. I hate to cut this off because that sounds fantastic, but I think I'm going to start with some introductions. And now that we're 5 minutes after, people may continue to roll in as they always do, but it would be great to kick things off. All right, so welcome everybody. We have an excellent panel today talking about space diplomacy. So first off, I want to shout out Sunny and Nicholas and Juliana for all of their hard work putting this event together. My name is Lindsay Weiser. I'm the Legislative Affairs Lead and now the Deputy Task Force Lead for SGAC's Task Force on U.S. Space Policy. I'm also an astrophysics PhD student in my day job. And our task force envisions a sustainable, fair, and cooperative development in outer space to benefit all people on Earth. And we aim to further this vision through educating policymakers and important space policy actors on issues facing the younger generation. So today's panel on space diplomacy is the second event in our Space in 2050 series, where we take a long-term perspective on space policy issues to better understand how the impact of space challenges, better understand the impact of challenges on the younger generation in the decades to come. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists and our moderators who will have a 30 to 40-minute conversation before opening up the floor to some audience questions that you can feel free to put in the chat throughout the course of the call. So for our first panelist, we have Daniel Porras. Daniel serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at the Secure World Foundation. He is an expert in international space law and policy, emerging technology threats, and political science. He works to develop partnerships and conduct outreach for the development of sustainable norms of behavior in space, and has been a technical expert for multiple UN bodies working on space security issues. So welcome, Daniel. We're excited to have you. For our second panelist, we have Mike Gold. Mike serves as the Executive Vice President for Civil Space and External Affairs at Redwire Space. And he previously served as NASA's Associate Administrator for Space Policy and Partnerships. He has been responsible for formulating and leading a comprehensive study or strategy to integrate domestic, international, intergovernmental, and industry policy across the space domain, including priorities that enhance the resilience and capabilities of the Artemis program. So welcome. We're excited to hear perspectives from you as well. Our SGAC members, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Sunny and Nicholas. Sunny is a postdoctoral fellow at Florida State University and with more than 15 years of NASA experience across engineering and biomedical disciplines. He leads investigations studying the physiological effects of spaceflight in support of Artemis. In addition to all of that, he has the time to be the external affairs lead for our task force. So thank you for your time, Sunny. He's been leading the planning of this panel and will be moderating the chat throughout. Nicholas is currently a systems engineer for Lockheed Martin Space. He has a galactic passion for space, is an active member of the SGAC Law and Policy Group, where he focuses on partnerships and congressional strategy. So Nicholas will be moderating for us today. And with that, I will pass it on to Nicholas.
All righty, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with Michael and Daniel. I am actually in Colorado too, so maybe we'll all get together. So I guess kind of going right into it right away, this panel is really about how diplomacy can ignite the growth in educational and economic opportunities in space. And as we know, over the past year and over the past few years, space has been changing very rapidly. We're sending citizen astronauts into space. We've got Mars helicopters. We have a probe going to the Trojan asteroids, and all this amazing things. And we also have the Artemis Accords, which is hopefully making a lot of strides in increasing diplomacy. So let's start off with, what has been some milestones and areas that have evolved that look very different than they did, 5-10 years ago in the space diplomacy discussion. And how do you guys both see it changing over the next 5 to 10 years? And of course, kind of the main question, I guess, of this whole panel is how can diplomacy really ignite that growth in educational and economic opportunities for all?
So I'm happy to jump in. And first of all, thank you, Nicholas and Lindsay and Juliana, especially Juliana. Shout out for your work on the GEGSLA in support of everything we're doing. And I want to thank SGAC, particularly for paying attention to law and policy. As I always tell the engineers, they've got the easy part. There's no rocket equation for Congress or COPUOS or any of those organizations, yet these policy issues, political issues, diplomatic, financial, legal topics, I think is really where we need to make the most progress in order to realize the robust visions of space exploration and development that many of us had. I really don't think it was the technologies that were holding us back in any way. And now that we've got a lot more entrepreneurship, a lot more diversity and commercial participation, we're really looking at an exciting future, what I would describe as a second golden age of space exploration. I mean, all of you and SGAC, I think, are very fortunate that, I know I look like I'm still in my 20s, but, believe it or not, approaching 50 here. And when I was your age, there was nothing like the opportunities that we have ahead of us now, certainly from a legal perspective or policy or space in general, that this growth of the commercial sector has been tremendous. And I would say that is, to answer your question, one of the most significant changes that we've seen in space law and policy is the growth of the private sector and the increasingly strong and leadership role that private companies are taking, whether it's in low Earth orbit or even going to the moon or Mars and beyond. And that poses both a number of benefits as well as challenges to the space law and policy environment, because as we talk about the United Nations or the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, structures internationally as well as domestically were not established to be able to accommodate the role that commercial entities are playing. So it's very important that we try and evolve space law and policy to match what's occurring in commercial, because we not only want diplomacy to ignite this new future that you're talking about, but also prevent a darker future, that we want space to be transparent. We want cooperation and peaceful activities, not conflict. And I think the actions that we take today will determine what that future looks like in terms of recent developments. So when I was at NASA, as one of the architects, along with a terrific team for the Artemis Accords, which were designed almost to the introduction that he just gave, to ensure a peaceful and prosperous future in space for all of humanity to enjoy, and to take the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts, and basically implement it to ensure that these activities that are occurring support our existing treaty obligations, as well as other common sense principles such as the full, free, and open release of scientific data. And I think it's been about a week that Mexico just signed the Artemis Accords, which I know you may not necessarily immediately associate Mexico with space exploration, but it was a really important signature because Mexico is working with Astrobotic in terms of actual operations on the moon. So they're very active, and it's terrific to see them doing so. And, they're really a leading voice for many developing countries and others in the region. And to see them demonstrating that commitment to a peaceful, prosperous future and norms behavior was really, really terrific to see. So I think that's, again, a recent development, and I'll shut up now and let Daniel talk. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Mike. You always give me so much optimism and enthusiasm for what's going on. But unfortunately, I work in an area of space law and policy that is anything but optimistic. So I've been working probably for a little over 10 years now in the prevention of an arms race in outer space. this is a topic that's been being handled by the United Nations for over 40 years now. And really the effort there has been to try and minimize or mitigate the worst possible consequences of conflict in outer space. And unfortunately, in the 40 years that they've been working on this topic, we have accomplished exactly nothing. It's pretty remarkable, but when you think about a lot of the complexities that outer space systems have with, or how they're intertwined with things like strategic military systems, so nuclear payload delivery systems, early warning detection, a lot of these different elements that space really is has a very strong role, makes everybody quite sensitive. And so for the last decades, really you've kind of had this bizarre division. It's not a bizarre division. It makes sense once you kind of break it down, but there is a division at the United Nations and amongst most member states where you've got the Western countries on one end who generally have a lot of concern about threats to their space systems. And then you've kind of got the rest of the world led by Russia and China who rather tend to see threats from space systems. And for years, we've kind of been at a crossroads where we're just butting heads and no one's really been able to make any headway. Well, the last few years have changed things drastically. And even from Mike's position, I'm sure he's seen a lot of this as well, in that, one, I think we're reaching a critical mass in space where there's just so much stuff happening up there now. There's so much investment that no country can afford not to come to the space diplomacy table and say, we got to find a solution to this problem. Many of y'all will have seen the Russian anti-satellite test that took place a few weeks ago, just above the International Space Station, and mind-blowing. I am absolutely convinced, and Mike will probably agree with me, that Roscosmos did not have any idea that this was going to take place, because the debris that is left up there will be a problem for the space station, and not just for the space station, but also for any satellite operator that wants to deploy assets up and around 500 kilometers. So SpaceX, OneWeb, Project Kuiper, the Chinese, the European constellations. And that was a hugely devastating signal to send to the rest of the world for whatever political reasons it was done. And I think a lot of folks are finally starting to get it. Now, the other thing that's changing is that the Western position on developing norms of behavior and coming up with a legal framework or some kind of a normative framework for outer space has also changed. In years past, the U.S. position has always been, we don't talk about treaties. We talk about political agreements, but we're not doing anything legal. And as a consequence, all the other Western countries went along with that. Well, things have changed in the last few years. We've really seen a big shift in the State Department, particularly during the Biden administration, where all of a sudden folks are actually open to at least considering legal instruments and different types of legal approaches to some of the issues that we're having with space security. Now, nobody is saying that we're going to be able to get to a treaty anytime soon, but governments like the UK and other what we call middle space powers, which are space actors who have a certain degree of access to space, but maybe they're not to the level of US and China, they're starting to lead this conversation whereby they're saying, look, rest of the world, we know that you would really like a treaty, and we've been rather opposed to it for the last few decades, but maybe we could get to something someday. But for right now, let's see if we can come up with some short-term solutions in the form of political obligations. And wow, that has changed the tenor of the discussions that are taking place at the United Nations. All of a sudden, we hear a lot more countries that in the past were on the other side of the aisle from the Western countries are now starting to say, hey, you know what? This could be a first step towards a much broader and much stronger normative framework. Let's take the first step. We have to at least give it a chance. So that's changing quite a lot. And the last thing that I'll say that I think is changing the way that space diplomacy is happening is the level of diversity that we're seeing. A lot more different countries are starting to come to the table, whereas before it was just certain types of country. I mean, it was always geographically diverse, but now we're starting to see economic diversity, cultural diversity, youth diversity, getting a lot more young folks who are participating in these discussions and saying, hey, these decisions that you're taking right now, we're the ones that are going to have to live with them the longest. here's how we feel about it, and this is what we would like to see. I think all of that input is starting to bubble to the surface, and we've got a new initiative at the UN right now, trying to set up a new open-ended working group to talk about space security. And I think all this momentum that we're developing is finally going to get us to make a move. It'll be a small move, I'm sure, but I haven't seen this much optimism towards achieving something in space security during my since I've been working here.
Well, those are great insights. And you actually answered my second question about, who are the main actors and stakeholders really in the industry and across the globe. I guess the next one would be, how do we increase public awareness of space diplomacy? So, when the ASAT test happened, I was actually attending Ascend virtually, and there was a big hoopla about it, and obviously, rightfully so. But of course, then the media and a few people in the public kind of rushed to the judgment of, all these aggressive actions, we're trying to militarize space. And there was a negative spin kind of put on space. So how can we go about actually making sure that the public is educated, accurately and effectively on these issues without scaring people or having everyone get the wrong idea? Michael, if you want to go first.
So let me begin with, I think it's critical, particularly for leadership in space law and policy, to never give in to inevitability of conflict in space. I don't believe that. Again, I applaud what Daniel and Secure World Foundation, SJC, what all of us are doing daily, and I've dedicated certainly a large portion of my career to prevent that, to, as I always say, create a future that's more Star Trek and less Star Wars. And I honestly believe that goodwill and the intelligence, the diversity, the drive that I see, and I'm inspired by SGAC and all of you, it is why I'm optimistic. The people that I see from across the world that want to pay attention and deal with this issue. And to an extent, we have succeeded, at least if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, of keeping weapons of mass destruction from outer space, et cetera. But we definitely have a publicity issue, not only as you look at something like the ASAT test, but look at the comments from even the UN Secretary General about the billionaire playboys and the sort of mixing wealth inequality, which is an extraordinarily important issue, with space development. And I don't think we've done a very good job in the space industry of explaining to people outside of the space bubble why space is so important to life on Earth. That, yes, you might see a Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson celebrating, but these are entrepreneurs who are putting, in many cases, billions of dollars in developing new technologies and new systems that will dramatically improve life on Earth and actually resolve or at least help to tackle many of the intransigent issues that we're dealing with. For example, climate change. So I was doing an interview, I forget whether this was back at NASA or when I was at Maxar, but with a BBC reporter asking me about why should we invest in space when there are issues like climate change to deal with. And I was flummoxed by the question because I said, we wouldn't even know about climate change or have climate research or be able to tackle the problem effectively if it wasn't for space resources. And to me, that demonstrates the epic fail that we've had outside of the space bubble, that someone could even pose such a question. And, I don't think there's a recognition of what, a SpaceX has done, et cetera. And here at Redwire, we're developing microgravity research, development, manufacturing techniques. We just acquired a company called TechShot that ultimately could grow organs in space. And I believe that in space, we will find ways to feed the hungry and heal the sick and improve life on Earth. But we need to do a much better job of explaining that And then relative to the ASAT test, I do thank Russia for providing a significant wake up call to all of us about the need for real norms of behavior in space to prevent such testing. And, you know, the Artemis Accords, of course, fantastic. And really, I think, have created common ground among a diverse set of nations on norms behavior for civil space activities, but we need a similar Artemis Accords like effort for national security activities. It would be good to see, if nothing else, a coalition of the willing come together to further define how close is too close when it comes to satellites, so that there's not some kind of inadvertent or miscommunication that leads to conflict, as well as a very clear condemnation of this kind of activity, and to deal with the constellations that are constantly growing. And just all the activities could become a threat to the environment. Now I believe we can find a way to entrepreneur our way out of such issues and leverage orbital servicing, assembly, manufacturing technology, next generation technology to resolve some of these issues. But we've got to tackle it with intentionalism. We need to be intentional. We need to proceed with alacrity. And then finally, I can't not take the bait on diversity. That if you look at the differences between Apollo and Artemis, I believe you can sum them up with the word diversity. That just even the very name of the program, Artemis, and the focus on putting the first woman, the first person of color on the moon, as well as the diversity of nations that are participating, that Artemis will be the broadest, most diverse human spaceflight beyond LEO coalition in history. And then the diversity of organizations, that now we not only have governments, but companies participating. I think that diversity is going to drive a terrific new future, and why I have hope. But again, we do need to tackle these issues with alacrity.
Yeah, I have to agree with Mike that the level of diversity that we're seeing it's just changing the conversation to a huge degree. So many more voices are coming in and are adjusting the way that we're talking about things. One of the big movements that we really love seeing right now is the change around language that we use to talk about space exploration. Trying to move away from things like colonialism and more towards things like settlements and a more comprehensive and inclusive idea of what space exploration will be. One of the things that I have found actually in all the time I've been working on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or PAROS, as we call it at the UN, is it's a lot less about space and a lot more about relationships. And as my partner is always reminding me, relationships are all about trust and communication. And part of the problem that we have right now is that there is such a great deal of trust and lack of communication between the major space actors. We don't like talking to each other. I think because of a number of political barriers, but they're almost becoming cultural and more deep rooted. The good thing is, I'm noticing that my mentors and a lot of the folks who I was coming up under and who taught me everything about UN diplomacy are starting to retire. They're heading out. There's an old way of doing business and an old way of conducting space diplomacy that I think is slowly kind of moving out. And as we start seeing more and more young people and more countries starting to get involved in this conversation, it's creating greater ties. Students who meet at SGAC or at ISU or at IAC and any of these other organizations then carry that with them forward. And all of a sudden, I see these situations where I'm like, God, what are the Russians thinking about this thing? And one of my interns will say, well, hang on a sec, let me call one of my buddies who's interning at this other office, and then we'll all kind of like swap some ideas and see what we can come back with. And there's just a great level of interaction. That stuff is going to stick. And I think as the younger generations and the new actors start getting more prominent seats at the table, we're going to start noticing a new dynamics in the way that people interact and how they talk to one another. And I'm hoping that comes with a lot more trust. Is this trust that has been developed by having drinks at a bar in the middle of the desert somewhere by a bunch of students that then bears fruit 20 years down the road, yeah, sure, great, I'll take it. So yeah, I think the small things that we do right now to create greater ties across these political, cultural, geographic barriers is starting to bear fruit, and I think we should continue to put our energies into those areas. Um, yeah, so keep it up.
So a hot tip, if you are in the desert having drinks, or even if you're not having drinks and go on an ATV, wear a helmet. Important advice for everyone out there.
Yeah.
Um, and again, I love all of Daniel's points, and particularly we talk about language. It wasn't too long ago that everything was manned space flight, right? And again, not to be word police, but seeing the end of that term and the broadening of diversity and just the acknowledgement about the way that we talk about these things is so important. And not to harp back on Mexico, joining the Accords, but the number of countries and the kinds of countries that can participate in space, and driven largely by the commercial revolution, has been so wonderful to see that space can be accessed by the entire world. And this goes back to the criticism of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. They're only going to lower launch costs further, which will allow more countries to participate. And again, deal with everything from famine to human trafficking, everything. There's going to be, again, so many terrific applications out there. But I will say that COVID is not helping it. That, Daniel is so correct relative to the need to build trust. And part of the challenge, certainly over the past 2 years, has been you can't have those side conversations at those drinks at the United Nations, that we're not building those bonds, and the ability that the fact we can't meet in person has really, I think, been challenging for that kind of soft diplomacy that's so necessary and helps lead to these relationships that, again, Daniel's exactly correct, that those relationships are the key to breakthroughs in the diplomatic era, that we know everyone, we're friends. But if we can't develop those relationships due to COVID, it becomes much more challenging. So I hope that we're meeting in person soon. I believe that we're going to switch to hybrid, Daniel, for the UN meetings coming up, which is a step in the right direction, so we can, at least some of us, get together.
Well, it seems like we have a lot to look forward to and a lot to work to. And I'm going to ask first Daniel on this one, because you kind of hinted at it. How can us young people today who want to help solve these issues and, help fill these gaps, what should we be looking at and thinking of doing in the next 5, 10, 20 years to really strive to get that maximum diplomacy and those maximum, efforts of collaboration?
Meet people from other countries, try to create those ties and be open. One of the things that I first started finding when I was a young man and starting to travel was I didn't even realize how American centric my worldview was, and so making friends and meeting other people from other cultures and having them kind of show me the ropes and the way they do stuff, and feeling like an idiot all the time. Just traveling to other parts of the world where I was the foreigner standout, really helped build a lot of patience, and at least taught me to take pause whenever I'm trying to analyze a problem and really try to look at it from a different perspective. I think one of the problems that a lot of diplomats in some of the older generations greatly lack is empathy. The ability to look across the aisle and to empathize with the other person that you're talking to. I've had it out with a number of U.S. diplomats who think like, no, Russia and China don't have the right to defend themselves. That's our job. Easy, guys, easy. Like everybody thinks that they're right, and the purpose of space diplomacy is what compromises can we make so that everyone comes away feeling like they're respected, like they've been heard, like they're still able to advance their own interests without having to give way to somebody else's interests. And all of that is personal. It's not a question of astrodynamics or physics or anything else. It's just about learning to talk to one another and respect each other. So space is going to force us to have some of these come together moments. But in order to really make them work, I think we have to have these personal relationships and this kind of desire to want to work together, and it won't happen if we don't meet. So, like I said, I encourage all of y'all to attend as many international meetings as you can, find as many like totally different people as you can, go share a coffee, go share a drink, just sit down and interact a little bit, so that later on, when you're reading stories in the news about things like, Russia blew up a satellite, so that when you think Russians, it's not just a faceless thing. It's a person. It's your friend. Sorry about that. And yeah, I think so many more of the issues, the solutions that we're going to find are going to be human based rather than space based or technology based. I think I just gave you all permission or instructions to go drink.
Mike, do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, again, you won't find much disagreement here. I would advise you to go to whoever your greatest rival is and make friends with those folks. We're coming off a GEGSLA, which I mentioned before. I don't know if I can even do the full acronym, the Global Experts Group on Lunar Sustainability, something. Daniel or Juliana can help me out. But, part of the reason that I've spent what little time I have, and I have almost no time on a group like that, is candidly because there's been, in part, robust Chinese participation. And I'm leading a subgroup covering everything from safety zones to environmental sustainability with my terrific Chinese co-chair, Lindley, and Guoyu Wang, who was part of the Hague International Space Resource Governance Working Group, and I'll get him in trouble by calling him a friend, work side by side with all of us in the Hague. And that's where, again, part of my optimism comes from, because I think particularly relative to these norms of behavior, there isn't that much of a gap between the two perceived rival powers, that I think there is great common ground to be found between the US and China in particular. And we've got a Russian colleague that we're working with as well, and the Australians, Canadians, et cetera. The GEGSLA has been a great experience of that. Again, part of the challenge is we haven't been able to meet in person outside of a group of us at IAC. And I think it would be even more effective if we could have that human contact and conversations that Daniel's talking about. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. That being said, I think we also as a community do need to be united in condemning something like the ASAT test that Russia did. That if we don't stand up to the bullies, and again, there's nuance, right? That, like Daniel describes, you don't want to condemn an entire country per se, but we certainly need to condemn the action and those who supported that. And I think it's important for us to do so on a global basis. And then, if I can say, we need more activities more quickly. That, while I appreciate and would love to see more treaties and those kinds of activities go, and the accords are explicitly designed to help support eventual treaty making, these activities are happening now on the moon. And we need to do everything possible to move quickly, to lay down norms of behavior, to find agreement, to find common ground before there is any kind of conflict. Because while the moon is a large place, I believe that we're going to find it surprisingly limited when it comes to the regions that actually have a combination of solar power, of resources, etc. So if I can say, speed and time is of the essence to create a future that we can all be proud of.
Well, that's certainly great. And I think I'll kind of piggyback that with, do you guys also think, because I know we're mainly focusing on policy, but at the same time, I think, and maybe you guys can correct me on this, there's also room for technical innovation. I know that there's restrictions like ITAR and things like that between countries, but we do have Orion, and that's ESA and NASA working together, and Lockheed's on it, and a few other companies. Do you think that it's still feasible, to when we're landing on the moon and eventually going to Mars, that there can be a global collaboration, and that can also kind of stimulate diplomacy?
Not just feasible, but a necessity, that we must go to the moon as a world and overcome the challenges of ITAR. I used to joke that second only to gravity, export controls had the greatest chance of preventing anything from going to space. But we've made a lot of progress since those days. And maybe I don't want to take up too much time, but just to tell a quick story there. So when I was with Bigelow Aerospace, we launched Genesis 1 and 2, which were the first ever inflatable habitat prototypes that were launched into space. And we launched them leveraging the SS-18, designated Satan by NATO. It was a Russian ICBM. And again, I know I look so young, but believe it or not, I was a child of the Cold War. And I grew up fearing that these weapons would end life as we knew it and viewing the Russians as enemies. And then as an adult, to be on an active Russian nuclear missile base, taking these weapons of war, turning them into a tool for peaceful commerce, literally swords into plowshares, gave me great hope for what the future could entail. Now, relative to export control, that was a challenge that, we had, again, myself, several of our engineers, and across the table, several card carrying members of the Communist Party. But if you asked which is the free country and which is the post-communist dictatorship, or however we describe Russia, they point to the Russians as the free country, because I was traveling with not one but two DITSA monitors, monitoring every word that I said, breathing down my neck, and we were paying for it to the tune of $150. This is probably 15 years ago now, but it was still a lot of money. $150 per person per hour, plus room and board, plus travel, plus overtime. We probably ended up at Bigelow Aerospace paying the government about $300,000 to $400,000 just in fees alone, and export control compliance was about $1 million overall. So I would joke with the Russians that, hey, KGB may have spied on you back in the day, but at least they had the good courtesy to do it for free. I'm paying for my government to monitor me. And it's not that I'm against export control. I recognize their technologies need to be protected. But for example, we had what was called the Genesis Tech Stand, which was a very poor name, but it was really a metal coffee table with four legs sticking out to keep the spacecraft from laying on the ground. Flip the coffee table over. I mean, again, some nice cutlery, some napkins, indistinguishable from metal coffee table. Yet I had to have two guards watching that coffee table and then pay two DITSA monitors to watch the guards watching the coffee table. Now, I can only imagine the national security repercussions of this table technology leaking out to the Chinese, Iranians, where you could serve coffee or in a worst case scenario, even tea. But the point is that we managed to overcome that. We filed for waivers, we got through it. There were rules where back in the day, you might have had to have sent DITSA monitors with any foreign national that would go up to space. And at Bigelow Aerospace, we filed a trailblazing commodity jurisdiction request that took about, I think, 2 years in the end. I remember my old slide showed my son when I filed the request and he was still in the womb. And then by the time we got an answer, he was wearing my Red Sox hat. But we did get it done. And then that became the law of the land and the later National Defense Authorization Act. So long story short, and again, lesson to all of us, it can take time, but if you persevere and believe in what you're doing, you can overcome even threats as pernicious as the ITAR. And we did that, and export control, I think, is a much better place. And I don't worry about export control. Or at least it's not going to be problematic. That yes, there's some hoops we need to get through. But again, if you look at the Artemis program, how broad, how diverse it is, we are absolutely baking in that this is going to be an international effort from the beginning, which, by the way, is important for sustainability. That, and again, sorry to take up so much time here, but if you look at Apollo, we all love Apollo, but there is a failure in Apollo in that it ended. It was not sustainable. As a matter of fact, failure was not just an option, but was a certainty for every American beyond LEO human spaceflight program since Apollo. And Jim Bridenstine was looking at that and said, well, why is that? And then you compare it to something like the International Space Station, and international is in the word, which has been sustained and thrived, et cetera. So the international aspect of human spaceflight is actually very important to sustaining these activities politically. It's that diplomatic commitment that you have to do. So again, I don't just view it as a luxury. I view international participation not only as the right thing to do, but a necessity for sustainability. And again, I was very proud to work with Jim and NASA to build that international coalition, as well as here in the US, the bipartisan coalition to support human spaceflight, because together is the only way that we'll be able to move forward successfully.
I'm not going to add too much to that. Also, I got to get going because the snow is coming down pretty hard now. Yeah, I also agree that international cooperation is going to be absolutely necessary, and part of it is cost. Like, it's really expensive to go to outer space, and for any one country to shoulder all of it, it's difficult. Also, lots of other countries are very interested in going now. But again, one of the things that I keep seeing is just that as time goes by, we seem to forget some of the initial context behind our own barriers that we set up to stop certain types of interaction. I think the Wolf Amendment, which has been around for 10 years, prevents NASA from working with any Chinese nationals. Even there, I think the way that the culture is changing on Capitol Hill and in Washington, folks are starting to ask themselves a little bit like, well, have we had the Wolf Amendment long enough? Is it still serving its purpose? Has it achieved its goals? Is it time that we start opening up a little bit of cooperation with China so that we can develop some trust and maybe better our relationships in other areas? If I were sitting in my cabin, you'd see on my left that I usually keep a portrait of Alexei Leonov. Alexei Leonov was a cosmonaut who fought really hard to get the Soviets to do missions with NASA. And so we had the Apollo-Soyuz link up in 1977, I think, and they opened up a door between the two capsules and shook hands. The first extraterrestrial international handshake. Space is a perfect area to try out some of those different activities. And as time goes on, I think we'll find areas that we can do small steps with our rivals. So maybe with China, maybe we'll work some more with Russia, with whom we have a very long history in space, and maybe we'll be able to develop some of that trust and communication that we need, so that we can all keep using space for a lot of wonderful, beneficial applications. And the moon is certainly one of those. I think one of those symbols that if we could actually get an international, very multicultural mission going and start seeing those pieces come together, much like what the ISS did for our relationship with the Russians, it could be a big step. So I've got my fingers crossed. But anyway, Mike, I'm going to let you finish this. I'm going to go hit the slopes. So everyone, thanks so much. Keep up the great work. And thanks to SJC for inviting me.
Stay safe, Daniel. No similar scars, so be careful.
Don't worry, I'll wear a helmet. Take care.
Okay.
Mike, thank you so much for your time and your insight and our conversation today. It's been really fascinating, and really appreciate perspectives you shared with regards to our human space exploration efforts being a international, collaborative, and interdisciplinary, a multicultural a project, and how intrinsic that is, and how it humanizes the space exploration experience. And on that note, just in the context of time, did have a concluding question with regards from our audience that asked about how if non-industry folks, such as legislators, may not understand the issues that we face in the context of human space exploration, perhaps it's viewed as a burden for us to make it more, make that perception, to shift that perception. So with that in mind, do you have any specific recommendations for overcoming these barriers?
Yeah, great question. And absolutely. We have to talk more about what it is we're doing in space and what those benefits are for whatever reason. And I suppose it's always going to be more exciting to watch a rocket go up than, perhaps talk about other activities. But we need to raise awareness and excitement over what we can do in microgravity, because I believe that the microgravity environment represents an entirely a new arena for scientific and commercial development that will impact a wide variety of fields, probably almost every economic area of endeavor, and that the companies and countries that are leaders in microgravity are going to be the economic leaders of the future. And this is part of what attracted me to Redwire, that we're the only company to have ever printed something on the International Space Station successfully, and have been the global leader in terms of in-space manufacturing, R&D, and now with TechShot part of the family, we've got even greater strength in biotech. So again, like the question that I got from the BBC reporter about climate change and why should we care about space? We've got other issues. Well, we can look at agribusiness and agricultural developments where we create new crops that could thrive in the desert to help prevent famine and to help fight climate change. We can develop new medicines that can cure diseases in ways that we probably can't even imagine right now. And again, organ replacement. And I can tell you, as much as I can talk about, growing organs or Z-bland fiber or other aspects, what's really going to drive the space economy and microgravity is probably something we're not even thinking about right now. So we need to talk more about that, because clearly that message has not been hitting home or has been adequately illustrated, particularly to the policymakers that, again, this great question references. So I think if we try and shift the dialogue more towards why we're going to space and what we're going to do there, then we can ultimately get better responses, more support, and end this, terrible narrative of, playboys going to space. I mean, there was a lot of champagne bottle corking and undoing in the aviation world back in the day, but no one said, this is just for, the ultra wealthy. I'd say aviation has made some significant contributions to the world and bringing all of us together. And that's as true, if not more so, in terms of space development. And speaking of the Russians, again, going back to my experience on the Genesis 1 and 2 launch campaigns, my Russian colleagues would complain that our billionaires, they just buy yachts. Yours create space companies. And I was very proud of that I think the fact that an entrepreneur would take the money and then try and reinvest in something that will enhance science, enhance exploration, enhance life on Earth is so important. And I really don't think that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos need the money at this point. I think they're okay. And part of the reason they even focus on generating dollars is only to implement and sustain better developments, continuing operations in space. So of course, I'm biased. I'm a believer that science can change the world, and that as we explore space, it will make all of us better in terms of diplomacy and provide technologies and innovations that, again, will create a future that I'm proud of and want to be able to hand down to my son and the children of the world.
Thank you so much for that. As a scientist, I really appreciate your kind words. And that actually, if there's time allowing, perhaps one more question that also connects with regards to projects and how they're perceived in space, where there may be opportunities to transform or change our momentum of a military industrial complex towards more of a peaceful or innovation platform in space, or large scale social projects. Would you be open to quickly commenting about that?
Sure. I believe that we must and will build a better future in space than we have here on Earth. We all need to dedicate ourselves to that. I've spent, again, the vast majority of my career, if not my life, trying to achieve that vision. And Daniel had mentioned Apollo Soyuz. Well, that historic first international handshake in space was done nearly at the height of the Cold War. And I think just the nature of space exploration, we've all heard about the overview effect, that you see how tiny our planet is and how similar we really all are, and that space is a crucible, that the challenges, be they financial or physical, force us essentially to come together as one humanity to be able to survive and thrive in the otherwise harsh environment. So, as Apollo Soyuz demonstrates, I can't think of a better place where diplomacy and international relations can flourish than in space. And relative to the militarization, I mean, look, that's an inherent part of who we are as a people, unfortunately, is conflict. So we need to acknowledge it and deal with it. And now you're all going to be exposed to a really bad William Shatner imitation. And hey, it's appropriate now that even he just went to space recently. But there's a wonderful episode of Star Trek called A Taste of Armageddon. And it's about two planets that were at war with each other. And then they, rather than have actual physical bombs and people get hurt, they had sanitized war. People were just marching into disintegrators so that the societies can continue without the ugliness, the pain of a war, yet still have it. And there was an argument between Captain Kirk and the leader of one of these planets, where the leader was saying, look, we're humans, we are killers, we have to acknowledge that we're killers. And Captain Kirk said, well, not today. That today we're not going to kill today. And that's all that it takes. That we just have to have that kernel of optimism, fan that flame of hope that today we're going to be better. And I think if we hang on to that and strive for that and develop these norms of behavior that will prevent conflict before it occurs, that not only will we avoid conflict and avoid greater militarization, but we will achieve the future that's laid out in Star Trek, and again, that we all want to be a part of.
Thank you so
So
much,
that's
Mike.
my plug and my homework assignment. Go watch A Taste of Armageddon, the original Star Trek series.
We'll have to shortly after concluding our talk. Thank you so much for your kind words and insight and perspectives. It was really a pleasure and honor to hear from you. And with that said, Lindsay, would you like to conclude our fantastic event today?
Yeah, thank you so much to Mike and Nicholas and Sunny and Daniel for taking the time today and for a fantastic conversation. It was wonderful to listen to. And thank you to our audience for joining as well. If you are part of the young space generation and are interested in helping advocate for a sustainable, fair, and cooperative space future, we would love to have people join our task force. And so the way you can do that for now is going to our website and signing up for the mailing list. And we'll be getting started for our 2022 cycle, probably in February or so. So I will drop the link to the website in the chat. And yeah, just thank you all for coming. It was fantastic. We will likely post a recording on the website as well if there's anything you want to go back and see again. And yeah, everyone enjoy the rest of their week and holidays coming up.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.